Gamers, what's good? So it's time for another tier list. Yubel's been in the game for about 2 weeks now, and since the release of Yubel, as well as some other cards, I feel like the meta has shifted tremendously, which is a really good thing. I'm really happy to see it. The meta was really getting stale, and I feel like right now the game is really fun to play. In fact, I've actually been enjoying the game so much that I jumped into the ladder that you have after you reach Master 1, and I've been doing decent. In fact, I'm currently top 5% players in Master Duel, you know? Top 5%, eh? For Misplay Central, I mean, that's pretty good. So I feel like I at least know enough about the current format to be able to talk about it, give you my opinions, tell you where I think the rankings are. Now, we do have a resource here. We have the Master Duel meta tier list that we can look at, but I do want to talk about that a little bit because there are some issues when looking at that tier list in particular. Now, don't get me wrong, this tier list is a really useful resource. The one thing is, this is mostly just based on community tournaments, and it isn't necessarily based on every single one. I'm pretty sure they only count the ones that have like a, you know, a pretty competitive rule set, but it will include results from tournaments that are best of 3. It'll include results from tournaments that have siding. So because of that, it actually affects the tiers quite a bit when we're looking at a format like ladder. My tier list is more so focused on what's going to be best to get you to Master 1 or get you to Master rank. So that's how I'm looking at the decks. So for example, here you have Yubel and Snake Eyes Fire King on the Master Duel meta tier list as the absolute best decks, and then you have like Rescue Ace all the way at tier 3. But I think a lot of this has to do with representation within tournaments. I mean, these two decks are basically brand new and super exciting and super strong, so people are playing them a lot. But I really don't agree, let's say, that Rescue Ace is suddenly not a top tier deck. Like, sure, they put the Airlifter to 2 and, you know, Bonfires at 2, but that doesn't randomly make Rescue Ace tier 3. So because of that, I feel like it is actually valuable to have these more opinion-based tier lists, just based on my experience in the ladder, and I definitely want to get your guys' takes in the comments as well. I just wanted to point out that even though statistic-based tier lists like this one are valuable, that doesn't necessarily make like opinion-based tier lists based on experience in the ladder format not valuable. Those are also really, really useful, especially because, like I said, this is very dependent on representation. For example, Branded is definitely not better than Rescue Ace or like other variants of Snake Eyes. It just isn't. But branded players are, you know, they're branded players. They play branded. That's what they play, you know. So it'll get a lot of representation, which will affect its ranking, of course, within these tier lists. So that's just my take on it. That's what I wanted to say in regards to these more stat-based tier lists. And now let's get to making our own. And as per usual, I like starting my tier list videos with the top tier. I know it's less epic, it's less drum rolly, but at the end of the day, I feel like, for one, people already know what the top tiers are, and also when we're discussing where other decks are situated, it's always very much so in relation to what the most played and best decks in the format currently are. And so I think it's a lot better to start with the best decks. So here's what I'm looking at here, okay? I think that the tier 1 best decks in ladder right now would be Fire King, Snake Eyes, by the way. We have Yubel, and we have Rescue Ace, Snake Eyes. I think Rescue Ace did not get worse enough off of just having only 2 Airlifter to just suddenly become not a top tier deck. This was by far the best deck in the game. I think you could debate the order for all 3 of these. Like, I think they're so close in power level, you genuinely could argue that any of these is the best. I'm going to put Fire King Snake Eyes here because it's the most popular and overwhelming deck in ladder right now, I would say. I feel like Yubel has like a lot of things going for it, but maybe less consistency than either of these decks, especially because like we don't have the Fiendsmith engine yet, and sometimes Yubel does get unfortunate hands. It's not an inconsistent deck by any means. It just probably gets more bad hands than either of these decks, which is why I would say it's not as good as this one. As for the reason I'm now putting Yubel over Rescue Ace, at first I thought Rescue Ace should go over Yubel, but the more I've been playing, the more I've been doing good with Yubel. As you guys saw, Misplay Central got to top 5% in Master Duel, which is a bit ridiculous, all things considered. So I think that's kind of a testament to how good the deck is. It's really, really solid, and you just don't see Rescue Ace that much. I do feel like Rescue Ace has its issues where, like, if you're able to negate Turbulence, that's really good. Personally, I'm still kind of convinced that Rescue Ace is just slept on right now because it's the best out of all of 3 of these decks at playing into Max C. You know, Turbulence into Max C is super crazy. Otherwise, it's really, like, stupidly easy to protect your turbulence from interruption, because you can just set up SP before you summon the turbulence, and then if they want to activate an imperm, you can just banish, you know, the turbulence and get your effect off. Or if they try to imperm it early, you can just link it away with like to make a Promethean, and then bring back your turbulence and activate it after they wasted their imperm basically. So I still feel like this deck is a bit slept on. Personally, I could see any of these decks being the best in the game right now, but this is definitely the top tier. It's definitely what the meta is revolving around. So from here, we can start ranking other decks. And let's start off with a new one that I think is doing really, really good. A lot better than I expected at first. I really underestimated this deck when it was like just before it came out, until I really practiced it a bit more. I think Centurion is probably the top of Rogue at the moment. There's a lot of cool things going on with Centurion. One of the coolest ones really is how many different engines you can play with it. It's really, really hard to get a read on if your interruption is going to be impactful or not, because a lot of the time when you see Centurion and Ladder, you just don't know what else they're playing. There's so many different variants. In a way, this deck is kind of unsolved, which can be kind of a strength for a road deck, because it's really unpredictable. And then there's also the fact that this deck plays really well into Max C, surprisingly well actually. Even though it's a synchro deck, it's more of a mid-rangey deck, you know, more kind of like a control strategy more so than an actual like wombo combo type deck. So I feel like Centurion top of Rogue is really fair for it. I've seen quite a few Centurion players, even all the way up to the master rank ladder. I've seen some top 5% players in the game play Centurion. So, you know, this is really, in my opinion, the top Rogue contender. The reason I won't put it higher than this is sometimes it dies really hard to very weak interruption. And there's also the fact that it's consistent, but you know what it consistently does is not the most impressive stuff ever. Usually you need extra gas to really make impressive combos turn one. Still, it has a really, really scary grind game if you're unable to stop it, and it has access to some really powerful synchro monsters. So I think it's really well situated at the moment. I think Rogue is a fair rank for it. Also, they keep playing deck lockdown, and that's just so annoying. All right, we can talk about Kashtira. I think this is interesting. So Kashtira, I think it's tier 3, but I don't think it's as good as it was before Yubel came out. The thing is, even though you'd think macro hurts Yubel a lot, it really doesn't hurt enough, I would say. Like, there's a lot of scenarios where I'm playing into macro or dimensional shifter with Yubel, and I can do enough to either like establish myself, or I can do enough to at least clear the board and, you know, put the game in my favor. So really, it's not like just dropping a Rise Heart and passing is not necessarily good enough most of the time to beat Yubel, but it will demolish Snake Eyes, and Snake Eyes is still most likely the more popular deck in the game. So it is still like a really good anti-meta contender. It's just that I think Yubel being in the mix makes it a bit less good for these like graveyard hate decks. The fact of the matter is, Spirit of Yubel will trigger whether it's popped and banished or if it's popped and sent to grave. So you'll still get to summon Yubel from your deck. You'll still get to set up your fusion negate. You'll still get to do a lot of things into macro or, you know, into shifter. It really depends also on your hand, but still, I've had a lot of success against graveyard hate decks with Yubel, which in my opinion makes them a bit less good than they were in the prior format. Still a really good option though. All right, next up we have Infernoble, and I'm including Mikanko with Infernoble because I think the best version of both of these decks is when they're played together. Mikanko Infernoble is a really, really terrifying deck. I would still put it at tier 3. I know a lot of people think I might be like overestimating this deck a little bit, but they really are the ops. I mean, I don't have a really great track record against this deck. Feels like it can do anything it wants on turn 2, it can do anything it wants on turn 1. It forces out all your interruption with the Infernoble cards, and then they set up like a pretty bare bones Mikanko board, which is enough after you've wasted all your hand traps, and you know, they'll just like gain control of the game and then just like go for lethal the next turn. They can kill on an empty board thanks to the Infernoble cards, kind of helping put big bodies on the field if they don't have anything to swing into with the Mikankos. And you know, going second also, they can bait all your interruption with Infernoble cards and then just go for Mikanko, or the opposite, they can force your interruption out with Mikanko cards and then just do a full Infernoble combo. So I'm still like really convinced that this deck is crazy. I know some people say I overestimate it, so you know, I'll take my L if that's the case, but I don't know, I keep losing to this deck, so I really don't feel comfortable putting it any lower than tier 3. All right, and next up, let's do Mathmech. I think Mathmech is still tier 3, like a really high tier 3 22. I think this deck is better than Rogue for sure. Like, it's still closer to Rogue than it is to top tier, but it has like really strong consistency. Its interruption is really, really hard to deal with. It has a pretty damn good matchup into Yubel actually, and it's just a really scary deck to contend with. I think there's just so many things going for it, not to mention that it's amazing going first, plays through a lot of interruption, and still has like some of the easiest OTKs in the game going second. Like, sure, Diameter is at 1 now, but I don't know. I don't think that's really enough to say that like Mathmech is suddenly like not amazing. It's still a great pick, and I've seen it all over ladder. I've seen it at the top of Master. I've seen it a little bit when I was, you know, doing my grinding in the post ladder, you know, so definitely I think it's a solid pick, and honestly kind of underrated in my opinion. All right, and let's touch tier 2 a little bit here, and what better deck to touch? I'm not saying that. Whatever. Labyrinth. Labyrinth, I still believe, is a top 5 deck in the game. I know Labyrinth players will be the first to tell me that I'm overrating it, or they'll be the first to tell me I'm underestimating it. But the thing is, Labyrinth, at the end of the day, is the best trap deck in the game. It has good going second turns, and it can play really well on turn 0. Happens all the time to me, where they like get basically like a full combo using the areas as well as like you know, the coup clock and stuff like that to just like basically play on my turn, which is really, really annoying. It's a really strong deck, and it has a lot of counter meta options because they can set up any normal trap that they want. They have a bunch of blowout like traps that will, you know, defeat basically any meta deck. They'll have something for every situation. Like I've noticed they're playing a bit more of Eradicator Epidemic Virus recently because of Yubel, and then they also have Daruma Cannon, which, you know, shits on Fire King Snake Eyes, and it shits on basically any Snake Eyes deck. They have a lot of really strong options into basically any deck, so they have a really good matchup spread, and I think the one thing holding them back from being top tier is really the fact that it's a trap deck, and also the fact that it is still quite susceptible to Ash Blossom. Rollback is good, but rollback doesn't always get set up. Like, it's nice when it does, but it's not that consistent to set up a rollback in the grave to just like make sure that you get to resolve your welcome Labyrinth, your big welcome, I mean. So yeah, while it is really, really great, and I think like damn near top tier, I don't think it's quite top tier. So, you know, I leave it in tier 2, but there's a reason it's one of the most popular decks in the game. It is just that good. Okay, and I mean, look, I know I talked some crap earlier, but I'm not like suggesting this deck is not good here. This is also a tier 2 deck, and I also think Branded now is probably a top 5 deck again, just because honestly, the Yubel cards are really insane in Branded. They're really just running the field spell and the Spirit of Yubel plus Yubel package, because that way they can activate the field spell, pop Spirit in deck, summon Yubel from the deck, and then they can shuffle both back into the deck and summon a monster negate before you ever get a chance to Ash Branded Fusion. Not only that, but oftentimes you'll want to Ash the Yubel field spell because you think you're playing against Yubel, and then after that they're going to normal Aluber and, you know, activate Branded Fusion, and you're cooked. Once Branded Fusion goes through, you're kind of cooked. This deck is really, really strong. I mean, the ceiling only got higher with time, even though they took a lot of hits and consistency and stuff like that, which like definitely hurts them quite a bit. I do think they're still just insanely well suited to a best of 1 format. So in my opinion, Branded, top 5 decks in the game right now, thanks to the Yubel engine. All right, and let's touch Rogue a little bit more here. I mean, this deck is always Rogue for me, but yeah, Heroes, it's a Rogue deck. I know a lot of Hero players want to pretend it's not. It is. Very interruptible, but, you know, has crazy combos. If it sets up its turn 1 board, pretty much unbeatable. Law, not as good as usual right now because of Yubel, so, you know, setting up Dark Claw isn't an insta win like it was in the prior formats, so it's not going to be as high of a Rogue deck for me. But still, at the end of the day, the order for Rogue decks is kind of like give and take. You know, they're pretty interchangeable depending on like what like your subjective opinion of the format. So yeah, Hero, it's Rogue. Okay, another really good Rogue pick, I think this one's like a high Rogue for me, would be like Zark. I think Zark is just the best Pendulum deck in the game at the moment. Some people might argue it's Pendulum Magician still, but I just disagree. Zark, the really cool thing about it is, one, it has an actually pretty solid play into Max C, where they can just simply set up the Zark trap and have at least access to like a really good field wipe without like summoning more than twice, I think. So that's really good. And then there's also the fact that Zark can run way more staples than your average Pendulum deck. There's a lot of free space in Zark decks to run, you know, the Maxis, the Crossouts, the Ashes, all that stuff. There's space for it. So I don't really care for Endymion. I think Endymion is just good in a vacuum, but like when you actually put it in the format, it just doesn't have the deck space to run the staples you need for a format like this, whereas Zark actually does have it. Because of that, it's better at going second than vast majority of Pendulum decks, and in my opinion, it's definitely worthy of at least Rogue. So yeah, Zark is good. We can just get it out of the way right now. I know I've done this, I think, for like 6 tier lists in a row. I'm this close to just not even putting it on the tier list anymore until like, you know, I don't know, I can find some new way to play it that makes it feel relevant again. But this format is really not kind to dinos. There's already all the graveyard hate going around because of Snake Eyes, not to mention that everyone's on so many hand traps. People have even started playing Droll again because Droll can be good into Yubel sometimes. And because of that, dinos are in like a dire spot right now. They're just so not well suited to this format. They're still playable, you know. Don't like, I'm not saying you can't win with dinos, but holy shit, if you get to master one with dinos, you are fighting such an uphill battle to do that. And honestly, you deserve all the applause because this deck is just not well suited for this format. The reason I've not been really dropping dino deck profiles is because most of my deck profiles are focused on decks that I think will at least get you to master pretty reliably, and I don't even think this deck will get you to master reliably. You need to get really lucky, for one, because there's the maxi minigame, and then there's also the not bricking minigame with dinos. I'd say like about a third of your hands with dinos are going to be bricks, even with the Xeno engine and stuff. It's just all like very normal summon reliant 2-card combos in dinos, which just hurts the deck tremendously oftentimes. So even if you set up like a half version of your board with like a weird hand, that's still not going to be really enough most of the time to deal with what decks are doing right now. UCT is still a great card, and I actually think Ultimate Conductor Tyranno specifically is great this format, but I think that's like the only thing, the really redeeming factor for dinos right now. Other than that, I feel like they're just kind of weak. Now, another high rogue deck for me, well, I don't know how high, but Floowandereeze, I think, is pretty well situated right now. I've even seen it again in the ladder, post ladder, so that's pretty impressive for Floowandereeze. I definitely can't sleep on it. I've seen it all around ladder. I don't see it often, but clearly it's good enough to get to the high ranks, and I think that has to do with the fact that, one, it's still a very, very good anti-meta option. The one thing that's really holding it back, and I don't really want to put it above Rogue, is that going first, depending on their hand, and they get some really tricky hands, they can die to like a single interruption a lot of the time. So often you'll like just use an Ash or an Imperm, and they literally just end their combo on turn 1, pass on just Robina or Robina in one set, you know. But they do have a lot of crazy options like Featherstorm, for example, or the fact that if they get fully set up, it's really, really hard to play through, especially for decks that rely a lot on links, such as Yubel, such as Snake Eyes. So yeah, I think it's a well-situated deck, even though, you know, it's still not the best. And next up here, we have Stun. And I think Stun is better than Floowandereeze right now. Stun has a lot of insane tools. The one thing about Stun is, while it is like way harder to interrupt going first, it's not like they're doing a bunch of searching and everything. Like, it's really not like Floowandereeze. You know, one Imperm usually doesn't stop Stun if they can get like 2 stun monsters on the field, or, you know, if they get a good amount of floodgates or a good back row. But, you know, one Imperm can help you going second. If they only have 1 stun monster on the field, you might be able to negate their stun monster, and if their back row isn't too high impact, you might be able to infiltrate the board, and then it's really, really hard for stun to come back. That being said, stun actually snowballs really hard if you can't deal with them like literally on turn 2. Because of Morganite, they get to draw 2 every turn, they get to normal summon twice, all that stuff, which basically means like they'll swarm the board with stun monsters, and you'll be limited on options. It's not like you'll have like that many cards, and typically you won't have that many cards to remove a bunch of cards from the field that aren't monster effects, and to get those monster effects, oftentimes you'll need to special summon them, which you won't be able to do. So you'll get insulated from playing really quickly with stun right now. It's a very, very scary deck. Honestly, arguably, I would say it could be better than Cash. The one thing is, it's so much worse at going second than Cash that I would never put it above Cash. Still, going first, this deck is so insane that you'll see it all over ladder. It's really well situated, and I forgot to put Horus/Horus Stun on the list, like in my options here, but I would probably situate Horus right around where Stun is, even though there's other builds of Horus, and Horus decks doesn't really mean anything because Horus is ran a bunch of different ways and a bunch of different strategies. But, you know, I would situate it around where this is, so you can include Horus with stun if you want. All right, this one might look a little bit weird. Super Heavy Samurai at this point, in my opinion, is worse than Floowandereeze. For one, it's not really an anti-meta option. It's about as good at going second, and going first, it's about as interruptible, but what it sets up is not as scary as Floowandereeze, and also this loses super hard to Max C. We can't ignore that Max C is in the game, so because of that, you know, this deck going first will win. This deck going first should win, but it'll lose to Max C. This one won't, and Max C is played in every single deck in the game pretty much, so yeah. I still think Super Heavy Samurai is a rogue deck. I know that sounds crazy, but I do think it's a rogue deck. Also, they got hit so much. Their consistency is so much worse. And now, like, oftentimes, again, one interruption will stop them, which is just crazy. Super Heavy is mostly run as an engine at this point, so I barely even want to put it on the list because you almost never see pure Super Heavy. But I don't really want to rank engines on this list because then it gets really tricky because it really depends on the deck that's running the engine. So I'll say this, if you run the Super Heavy engine in Centurion, you can bump this up to top of Rogue. But for now, as is, we're leaving it there. And actually, now that I think about it, I think Hero might be a little bit better. In fact, a bit less interruptible, honestly, and more consistent at this point, just because they haven't taken nearly as many hits ever, really, as Super Heavy. So, yeah, shout out to the Hero players. Okay, and here's a new deck that was added to the game recently. Let's do Magispector, and that's playable. Is it even better than Dinos? It's more consistent than Dinos, but what it sets up is so pathetic. Like, the board that Magispector sets up is just not impressive. It's really easy to play through. More importantly, going second, it's like atrocious. It has so few tools to go second that it's actually pathetic. Not to mention, their biggest playmaker, which is their main Link monster, is the only Magispector that can be targeted, which basically means that this deck loses to Imperm and Veiler too. It loses to Imperm, it loses to Veiler, loses to Ash. Like, yeah, I think Dino's better. Dino's better. Okay, and I don't put this deck on my tier list very often, but right now I feel like I just have to. So we're gonna do Sky Striker. I think Sky Striker is probably like at the bottom of tier 3. I know a lot of people are sleeping on this deck, but like I've seen it all around ladder. Clearly it's a good option. It has a crazy grind game. It plays pretty damn well into the meta, especially when it starts recurring its spells. It just snowballs like crazy. It's basically the spell version of Labyrinth, or Labyrinth is like the trap version of Sky Striker if you want. And it's also like very, very consistent, and the support has helped it actually quite a bit. Not to mention Engage is at 3, Kagari is at 3. Like, this deck can pop off like crazy now, and I really think it's a little bit slept on. In my opinion, really, really strong option for the current format, at least strong enough to be considered tier 3. So yeah, shout out to the Sky Striker players. I know I don't put you on the list very often, but right now I feel like I see you guys in ladder too much not to put you on the list. All right, and now let's do tier 3. Now, I'm a big believer in this deck, but I'll give it a fair rating. Nuria Horus, in my opinion, is really, really, really good. A lot of people thought that the deck got like way worse when Calamity got banned, but in my opinion, it just kind of like solved how you play. Now it's a lot more linear what you want to do on turn 1 if you have access to both Nuria and the Horus engine. So I still feel like this deck has a really, really crazy combo. It has good recursion. It has a really good grind game. The one thing is, it doesn't have the best consistency in the world, and it can sometimes die to like a single hand trap, but that doesn't happen often, and it has a lot of tools for going second. It can like play the long game. It plays really well into Max C. There's a lot of things going for it. I don't think it's quite as good as these other decks in tier 3 right now, just because the format is not that nice to it. But Nuria Beast does just straight up clear the matchup for all 3 of the best decks in the game. So if you're going first and you set up Nuria Beast, you're basically playing stun with also a bunch of combos and insane synchro monsters and recursion and just amazing XCs with the Horus engine. So I'm actually going to put it here. God, I love this deck. Okay, let's do Salamangreat. This deck loses harder into Maxi than any other of the Firelink decks. It's basically just the worst Firelink deck. I don't think it deserves to be even in tier 3, even though technically you could argue for it. I mean, every single time I faced Salamangreat, I've been like, oh, great, it's Salamangreat. This is gonna be like pretty easy. Not to say I've never been beat by Salamangreat. I have, but most of my games with Salamangreat go pretty smoothly. It's not the toughest deck in the world. I think honestly, yeah, it's probably like right above like Floowandereeze for Salamangreat. I would say like it's really good. I don't think it's quite as good as Zark, honestly. Although Like, at least this deck has a good play into Max C. This deck doesn't even have a good play into Max C. You could debate that it's like that Floowandereeze is better because of Max C, but I'll put it above just because going second, this deck is significantly better than Floowandereeze. So, you know, we'll balance it out. We'll put Salad in Rogue just above Floowandereeze. Okay, and next up, let's do a deck that I think got so much better that it's not even funny. Unchained. Now, I am specifically talking about Unchained with Yubel cards. So typically you play Yubel with Unchained cards, but you can also play Unchained with Yubel, and that's also a super, super strong deck. Potentially even better than I'm rating it right now, but for now, I'm going to put it just almost top 5 decks in the game. It's like, it still has the issues of, you know, your typical Unchained deck where, you know, it's a lot of 2-card combos and stuff like that. But the access to the Yubel combos makes it like, you could almost just say that it's another way of playing Yubel, which you could argue would make it up here. But I'm going to put it in tier 2. The higher focus on Unchained cards can hit your consistency a bit. And also, even though your ceiling's a bit higher, like, you won't necessarily play as well into a lot of the popular hand traps. So I think this is a fair rating for it. But I might be wrong about this, and I might turn out to change my mind over time and think that it's like better than I currently am ranking it. But yeah, for now, putting it at tier 2. Unchained with Yubel is crazy. Unchained Pure is not here, by the way. Unchained Pure is not here. I'm just telling you that right now. Unchained Pure is like here. It's like Rogue, because it plays so poorly into Maxi. Let's do Valmonica real quick. I think I used to put Valmonica in playable. I think I'm going to put Valmonica in Rogue, especially because we saw Valmonica get some actual results in my MDC Cup, and it made, I think, top 8 with a Valmonica Exo Sister list. And I've also seen Valmonica actually do quite well in ladder. I've seen it all around Master. Like, I haven't seen it often, but I've seen it at every level pretty much of Master, which, you know, just goes to show that the deck is good enough to get results. It's definitely an uphill battle, but, you know, it has actually quite good consistency, surprisingly, and you can do quite a bit with it. You know, I was playing it with like a MathMech engine, and I've seen a lot of other people actually use a MathMech engine in Valmonica in ladder, and I've even lost to a Valmonica player when playing Yubel because they got their full setup and I didn't have the hand traps for it. So it's definitely not a weak deck by any means, at least not weak enough to be considered not Rogue. It's also kind of hard to rank this deck just because it can be run with a lot of different engines, so there's a lot of different variants of this deck, and it's definitely not solved in Master Duel. But, you know, I'm going to put it in Rogue. I think it's good enough for Rogue. Okay, another deck for tier 2 here. We're going to do Tearlaments. Tearlaments, I still believe, is like the highest ceiling deck in the game, pretty much. Like, when Tearlaments pops off, it feels impossible to stop. Going second, if they get into their gas, it can feel like, you know, no amount of interruption is enough to stop them from doing what they want to do. And to this day, when I see Tearlaments, I'm more scared than I am of a lot of even the decks I put above it. The reason I'm not going to put it higher is because it does suffer from some consistency issues, in the sense that if your mills are not good, you might end up like not doing much of anything or being unable to play through like a single interruption. So, you know, it's a very high risk, high reward type of deck in that sense. It's not like an inconsistent deck by any means. I really just mean that, you know, sometimes you'll get the worst case scenario, and it's often enough that I've had my, like, I've played against Rhino Heart Pass enough times to know that this deck is not the most consistent deck in the world. That being said, it's still a very, very strong option, and probably the scariest deck of all of these when it comes to just going actually full combo. The shit that they can do is just ridiculous. Another deck I feel is tier 2 is Pearly, pretty much for the same reasons that I thought it was prior. Pearly, people say plays really well into Max C. I think that's very debatable. Like, sure, you get your summons early with Pearly, and then like you'll give your opponents like 1 or 2 draws if you just chain your quick play spells to it. But that can like kind of mess up your hand, and your hand doesn't always allow to play into Max C that liberally, where you're just like activating your quick play spells and discarding instantly and just, you know, going like, oh, whatever, who cares? Especially because like if you do that and then your Pearly gets impermed or ashed or whatever, and you can't like, you know, recur another card to set up exactly what you want, that might like hurt you in the long run. So Pearly, I don't think plays that well into Max C that, you know, you can say like, oh no, this deck is amazing into Max C. I still think it's good. You know, it has good plays into it. And there's also the fact that Pearly going second, at least in my opinion, is not very good. It's quite easy to interrupt. You just have to chain basically any card to their flash spells after they have their Xyz monsters on the field, and you can stop their Xyz from attaching the spells and getting extra effects. And so it gets really, really hard for them to play, especially because they need cards in hand to discard. So a lot of their plays are like high investment. So anything you stop is gonna like doubly hurt Pearly when they're going second, which makes it, yeah, like it has good OTK plays. It has all these things going for it. It can make an easy Zeus, but if your deck sets up a half decent board, they should not be able to play through it with Pearly. So in my opinion, Pearly, while it is still tier 2, I'm probably putting it like on the lower end of tier 2, even though I still think this deck is a crazy option for sure and absolutely will carry you to Master 1. Not to mention, I mean, X-Pearly Noir will carry you on its own when you're going first, just because almost no one is running outs to it. The most popular decks, you don't really need Kaijus for them, and Kaijus don't really do much for you against them. So no one's really running the outs to X-Pearly Noir. That card alone is basically carrying this deck right now, I would say. And the fact that this deck is very, very consistent, generally speaking. So really solid deck, don't get me wrong. Just going to put it on the lower end of tier 2, which is still insane. It's like right next to tier limit. Like, come on. All right, here's another solid rogue option. We have Sprite. I think Sprite is probably like right above Heroes and under Floowandereeze. Sprite has really good consistency now. SP was a huge help to Sprite, and they also still have access to their really, really strong going second plays with the Shadow Mosquito, which is really good into decks like Fire King because you don't have to send anything to the grave or pop anything, so you won't be proccing any of those destruction effects on the fire monsters. And it can play through quite a bit of interruption, but it is quite hand dependent. It also is not the best deck at playing into Max C, so there's like some definite weaknesses to the deck, but definitely I feel like it's better situated than it was in a couple of formats prior. And you can even run a weird Sprite build where you're running Shifter, because Shifter doesn't hurt Sprite so much that you can't play, and being able to play Shifter is quite useful. Again, not the best now because Yubel doesn't care as much about Shifter as these two decks do, but it's still really, really strong to be able to play it. So yeah, I think Sprite is all right. It's good. It's in Rogue. Just on the fringe of being Rogue, I'm going to put Memento. The reason I consider Memento playable instead of Rogue is because until we get the Memento support, if you know what to interrupt in Memento, they should not be going full combo. I mean, for one, if you stop the horse, usually that's just the end of their turn, or if you stop their fusion, that's usually the end of their turn. Because of this deck is so interruptible, it's really just a knowledge check, and this deck will feel Rogue if your opponent doesn't know what to negate and they like, I don't know, they Ash the Anguish and then you chain your horse, or you go horse and then it's like, oh, you Ash my Anguish. I didn't care about that. I'm going to go full combo. And then it feels like you're playing a rogue deck. But really, if they interrupt the right cards, this deck starts to feel more like a playable deck. And I feel like as you get higher into the ladder, people will know what to expect with this deck a bit more. And it'll get harder and harder the further into ladder you get. So I definitely don't think it's an easy deck to climb with. Although it is still like a really solid pick. And it has really good consistency. Better consistency than either of these. It has a lot of really good one-card combos. Or like, you know, slightly weaker versions of its one-card combos that you can do. So definitely not a deck to sleep on by any means, just not like, you know, once we get the support, we could see this deck like skyrocket up here. I'm just waiting for that support. And I'm gonna put this right above, I would say, Super Heavy Samurai. Sword Soul is still like pretty good. You can even run Sword Soul with Centurion. I've heard some people talk about that. Now I haven't tried that, and I feel like that sounds kind of like you're gimping both engines, so I don't know if that's all that good, but at the end of the day, Sword Soul still does what it has to do. It has really good combos. It can run a ton of hand traps, which will carry. The staples in Sword Soul is what makes it stay for so long. I don't feel like it's really that great of an option, generally speaking, but you know, if you play Sword Soul, you're definitely going to have an easier time than the decks down here, and it's significantly harder to interrupt than the decks down here. You know, you have a lot more access to gas, a lot more access to like tricky plays that allow you to keep playing, so it's not like a, you know, just negating the fusion and then suddenly you win, or you negate the link in Magic Spectre and then suddenly you win. In Sword Soul, it really depends on the hand what you should be negating, which, you know, gives it a bit more leeway, and I think makes it still good enough to be Rogue, although like I'm kind of iffy on this one, but I'll leave it in Rogue. You know, shout out to the Sword Soul players. All right, this one I'm not going to put on the list, but I'll just talk about it very quickly. Vanquish Soul, I wanted to put this on the list, but I really couldn't figure out a spot for it. The thing is, I haven't seen anyone play Vanquish Soul at all this month. Like, I haven't seen a single Vanquish Soul player. I've seen more Val Monica players than I've seen Vanquish Soul players, and you know, yeah, it has Shifter, but like I said earlier, Shifter now is not as high impact because of Yubel. So I've been like completely incapable of figuring out a spot for Vanquish Soul. I just want to ask if someone's watching and they play Vanquish Soul, could you leave like a comment just like explaining where you would put Vanquish Soul on the tier list and like the pros and cons of the deck right now? Because I really don't, I can't wrap my head around it. I'm really not sure about Vanquish Soul at all. So I'm not going to put it on the list. I don't really like putting a deck on the list that I have like no clue where I should be putting it. And I mostly want to put decks on the list that I've actually seen in ladder, you know. This deck, I just don't know. I really just don't know. So let me know. All right. And the last deck we're going to do today is Manadium. Now, Manadium, I'm feeling like is around where Zark is, you know, because it has a lot of the similar strengths to Zark, where it can, you know, it's a really strong combo deck, you know, and, you know, it can run a lot of hand traps, it can run a lot of staples. I would, however, put it right under Zark. Well, it's tough. It has a higher ceiling than Zark for sure. And honestly, like, it can play through more interruption, generally speaking, than Zark, I would say. But it loses to Maxi way harder than Zark. At least Zark has access to that trap play, which is like 2 summons or one summon depending. And, you know, you get your trap set up and you have a field wipe, you pass on the field wipe, you know, and, you know, you're like, I'll just bet on that. With Manadium right now, until we get Furos in the game, I mean, you're just like giving your opponent 5 draws to summon like Baron de Fleur, you know. So to pass on 1 interruption, you're giving your opponent 5 cards. You end up kind of having to not play much of the time when you're playing this deck, unless you run the Scareclaw trap, I guess, and you get lucky and you have access to Scareclaw in your hand. Then maybe you can do something. But a lot of the time, it's already too late to do that because your opponent will usually wait for you to have a monster on the field before going max C. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like this deck is just not super well situated right now. Definitely over time it's gotten like to a point where Super Heavy Samurai is significantly worse. And don't get me wrong, I still think this is a great combo deck at the end of the day. I just don't see the vision. And I know a lot of people played with Tier Limit, but I feel like the Tier Limit version of Manadium is the highest risk, highest reward version of the deck, where like it's extremely high rolly, but also probably the least consistent version of the strategy that you have access to. So honestly, I feel like a Tier Manadium deck is just like a really significantly worse tier deck, even though the board is crazier, and if it pops off better than any deck you've ever seen, whatever. Yeah, I think this deck is Rogue, a high Rogue contender. I think it's good enough that you can get to Master 1 with it for sure. It's just that that's an uphill battle. This deck, you know, there's just a lot of tricky things about Manadium that make it not feel the best in Master Duel right now. Oh, and I forgot the most important part. Hold on. Let me add a row above here. Yeah. Elder God tier. I forgot. Of course, tier 0 here we have Penguins. So obviously we have Penguins, you know, at tier 0, most unbeatable deck in the game. But as most people know, we all have this gentleman's agreement where nobody plays it because that would be really unfair and would make the game really unfun. So every Master Duel player kind of has this gentleman's agreement where we just don't touch Penguins because, again, we want to keep the game fair. So we're just going to be playing these weaker strategies like Fire King, Snake Eyes, and Yubel, and we'll just leave this deck alone so that we can actually have a good time in ladder. But that's the list, guys. I want to know what you guys think in the comments. I hope it was an enjoyable video. I might have yapped a bit longer than I usually do in this one. And I think the tier list video might be a bit later than I wanted it to be as well. But at the end of the day, at least I got to have a decent look at the format before making my list. And so I feel like it's a bit more well-informed than if I just tried to drop a list before the cards even come out that a lot of people do, or like right as they come out when we don't even know who's playing what, you know? So I think my style of tier list, while it might not be the most popular, it probably is. I don't think it's a little bit better, to be honest, just because we actually wait to actually look at the format before doing it. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. I'd like to know my L takes, my awful takes. What do you think? All right. Peace.